All right, glad to have everybody back. We'll pass it over to Professor Sorshins, who's going to be our moderator for the afternoon panel. Professor?
Had to remember to unmute myself. It's always the thing in Zoom. Unmute yourself, right? All right, so welcome for panel 2 of the Washburn Symposium on Artificial Rights. What we are going to look at now is really the second part of the question: artificial wrongs, biases, regulation, what have you. And we have 4 fantastic speakers with us today to discuss this. Let me introduce them in the order in which they will speak to you. We have Bob Lambrechts, who will speak first. He is a partner at Lathrop and Overland Park. Bob has filed nearly 600 patent applications in the United States and over 400 patent applications in foreign jurisdictions. He's also an adjunct professor at UMKC in the law school and at the engineering school. And prior to, really importantly, prior to law practice, also has a background as a senior automation engineer. So he has both a legal perspective and an engineering perspective, practical and academic, that he can bring to the question of artificial intelligence. Then next we will hear from Kimberly Hauser. Kimberly Hauser is an assistant clinical professor of business law and the law of emerging technologies at the University of North Texas in Dallas. Her primary research explores data privacy and focusing in particular on the US and the EU, as well as artificial intelligence in the context of US, EU, and Chinese tech policy and regulation, 5G technology, and unconscious bias and diversity issues. And before teaching, she practiced in the Chicago as general counsel to an Austin, Texas startup. After Kimberly, we will hear from Arthur Reiser. Arthur Reiser is the Director of Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties at R Street. R Street is an institute that deals with a variety of issues over at George Mason. And Arthur heads the institute's program dealing with crime, policing, intelligence, and privacy. And in this capacity, produces original research and writes for the popular press and policymakers on criminal justice and civil liberty issues. He's also a visiting lecturer at the University of London, University College London, and there in the Department of Security and Crime Science, and is also an adjunct at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. Before joining R Street, Arthur was an associate professor of law at West Virginia University College of Law and visited at Georgetown University Law Center. Last but not least, we will hear from our own David Rubenstein. David is the James R. Arns Chair in Constitutional Law and a professor of law here at Washburn, and teaches in the area of constitutional law, administrative law, and jurisprudence, and has done path-breaking work in questions of federalism, and now has turned to questions of AI and the regulatory reach that is necessary in order to deal with the emerging problems that come out of AI. So with these introductions done, you can really see that we have a fantastic panel to look at bias, regulatory questions that come up in the context of AI. Before we get started in earnest, Bob, can you just briefly give us a baseline about what is it that we're talking about definitionally in the context of AI?
AI really is the science and technology of making intelligent machines. And it's also known as the cognitive technologies. It kind of includes under one umbrella, the deep learning, the vision processing, the natural language processing, all of that. And it's obviously a very complicated area of technology, and as we're learning throughout the day here of law also. So with that, let me see if I can make the technology work for me. All All right, so everybody see my screen?
Yes.
All right, great. So my question that I was going to pose is, does artificial emotion intelligence have a role in the legal system? And kind of a broad question, but the way this all came about is, as Freddie had mentioned, I had worked as an automation engineer back in the early 80s at a facility that was involved in the production of nuclear weapons components. And we were in the process of trying to automate as much of that as we could, setting up flexible manufacturing systems to build very sensitive components for these weapons, and using robots and very sophisticated numerical milling machines, all of which was going to be tied together into an AI type system. But I think, as Kate mentioned earlier on in the presentation that she did over the lunch hour, the computing power really wasn't where we needed it to be. I had left there before it really came into full production, but it was certainly something that they were working on. It was a Department of Energy facility. We had lots of money, but we were struggling with the technology back in the early 80s. The other thing that kind of piqued my interest is, for 28 years, I served as a reserve officer in the US Navy. And obviously, the Department of Defense has an enormous amount of money to spend on things like artificial intelligence, and they are spending it. And they also have their own set of directives that deal with how AI is to be implemented. But as I was preparing an article I wrote for the Kansas Bar Journal last year, this topic of artificial emotion intelligence, or affective processing, came up, and I just thought it was kind of an interesting topic, so I thought I'd share it with you all today. See where it leads us. So, some terminology: artificial emotion intelligence, emotion recognition, affect recognition, emotion AI, affective computing, all kind of all terms of art that that are used here in this area. So, what is this affective processing? And just need to make one adjustment here. Trying to get rid of something on my screen that's
Click on display settings and switch them at the top.
Well, I'm trying to get rid of the all the pictures of all of you. Not that I don't want to see your faces, but well, let's see here.
If you go,
I'm just having a hard time here. I'm sorry.
You may want to just click on the speaker view at the top right, and that'll put all the little boxes over on the side.
I can't even get my own slides back now.
Still have share screen at the bottom.
No, I don't actually see that. I'm not sure what's happened to my.
Let's do a couple things real quick. Hit escape. And go to the top right corner and minimize your Zoom screen. Or if you see shares, or you see at the bottom of your panel, the share screen.
Let's try that again.
Okay. Now you can start again if you want. Or go back out and then open your Zoom again. Or open your PowerPoint, sorry.
I just cannot seem to get it to come back.
do you have more than one screen, Robert?
Two screens, yeah.
Okay, that's why. You're probably sharing the wrong screen.
Go to your share screen at the bottom and it should bring it up.
It is just not cooperating with me here.
Go ahead and minimize this. You might be behind it. It might be behind you too.
Oh, there we go. Maybe that's going to get it now. I thought I. I tell you what, is it possible maybe Kimberly can jump on and, because I can't seem to make this work, maybe I can drop in second here.
That sounds like a good plan then. If Kimberly, if you're ready.
Sure thing. We do share my screen here. Oh, it says I cannot share it until, oh, okay, I should be.
Yeah, you should- so,
Okay, can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Pardon?
Not yet.
Okay.
Excellent. Yes.
Now you got it? All right. Okay, so what I've done is I've prepared a presentation regarding artificial intelligence and employment decisions. I based this on a paper that I wrote really targeting the tech industry in terms of their lack of diversity. And what I had suggested as the thesis of my paper was that by using artificial intelligence, they can overcome some of the unconscious biases that I feel are involved in the lack of diversity, as opposed to what what news articles seem to focus on are very overt cases of discrimination. I think the real problem are what I consider the covert cases, where you can't really put your finger on why we keep hiring the same people over and over. So there are a lot of ways that artificial intelligence has been incorporated into human resources. And it begins with the applicant phase all the way through employee reviews. A lot of it is really involves more of an automation aspect, although some of it really goes as far as machine learning and predictive analytics. So it's a whole range of features that are being adopted by companies, primarily for cost savings. Most of them are not adopting AI for the express purpose of reducing unconscious bias in employment decisions. But what has been discovered is that has been a side effect of these uses. So the reasons for this adoption include the automation. They can enhance the communication between applicants and the companies. One of the biggest complaints that people have today is, we submit our resume and we never hear again. This kind of gives a better impression to applicants when they are reminded or sent automated texts or emails letting them know where they are in the process. Neuroscience games are a way in which anyone can go online to a website. They can play these games, and what it will do is it will recognize behavioral patterns, skills, and traits of the people who are playing these games. What that does is a couple of things. First, it kind of gets around this whole setting up barriers to entry into certain positions, such as requiring a college degree or things like that. And it can really focus on the types of skills you would need. This is especially, I think, applicable to the tech industry, but it also works for other types of positions as well. For example, if you think about a company that's hiring a salesperson as well as an accountant, the skill sets for those two are obviously different, but also behaviors are different. For your accounting department, you want people who are very risk averse, whereas with your sales function, you want people who are more outgoing and willing to take risks. And these neuroscience games can kind of pick up on that. It can improve employee retention. There's been a lot of interesting studies that show that artificial intelligence can basically predict when somebody's ready to leave a company, and being able to identify these people in advance and do things to retain them saves the company a lot of money in having to hire people to replace them. The two main areas, though, that I think are the most interesting and have the most potential are that of mitigating unconscious bias in employment decisions and eliminating noise. So unconscious bias, my paper relies heavily on the work of Daniel Kahneman, who is a Nobel Prize winner, and some of his collaborations with Amos Tversky. They began writing in the 1970s and became like Daniel Kahneman is something of a rock star in the social science field. He's an amazing person. But one of the things that he noticed is that people use shortcuts in their brains because they have to. You can't reason everything out. The problem is the more you use these shortcuts, the more embedded they become in your thinking. So I just wanted to mention a few of the biases that I think are applicable here. First is availability bias. This is the concept that when somebody indicates, for example, a position to you, you visualize it in your head. So if I say pilot, a lot of people will immediately picture a white male. That's not because they're prejudiced, it's because availability bias comes into play, and that's what they most easily picture. With confirmation bias, this is where we tend to focus only on those facts that support our pre-existing opinion. So we like someone that we meet in an interview, and then we ignore kind of the little things that don't quite mesh with the right employee for the job. And this tends to amplify certain types of prejudices, especially affinity bias. And affinity bias is this idea that we really like people who are like ourselves. So people who look like us, people who went to the same schools as we did, who maybe grew up in the same area of the country. It's a natural affinity, but what it does is it has this discriminatory impact, even though that's not the intent. Just because you like someone doesn't mean you don't like anyone else, but it really amplifies difficulties when it comes to employment decisions. A new area that Daniel Kahneman has been exploring is this concept of noise. And I've become absolutely fascinated by it. I don't want to spend too much time on it. I've cut down my slides, I've cut down my slides a lot to fit in the 15 minutes that are allocated, but I just wanted to cover this part because it's very interesting, and you can really see how artificial intelligence can eliminate noise. So Daniel Kahneman's research into this area involved insurance underwriters. And what he had discovered was that with insurance underwriting, it's very important that you have consistent decisions. And what he kind of expected to find is that you could give the same file to two different underwriters and they would have differences in how they evaluated the risk. A lot of them had pretty substantial differences in the risk, but what he found that was even more interesting and surprising is that you could give the same file to the same person, but just change the names. And depending on their mood, depending on whether they were hungry or not, depending on what time of day it was, they would come up with different decisions. So you have this inconsistent decision-making that all humans engage in. So one of the, tying this back to the unconscious bias issue, we have this thing called validity illusion. And with validity illusion, what we tend to do is we overestimate our ability to make accurate predictions. And what that means is that when we choose an applicant, for example, we double down. We say, this is the person, even if we're shown evidence that would conflict to what we've already decided, we still believe that we are correct. So we choose these applicants, we like to keep these applicants, but we don't even understand that we're being very inconsistent from applicant to applicant, and even with our own views on how we're choosing people. So with the AI solutions that can be used, I'm just going to name a couple here. First is this idea of whiteboard interviews. Now in the tech industry, this is really a very good way to assess people, because you basically hide their name, you hide their gender, you hide their race, and you allow them to solve problems on a whiteboard. So when you are reviewing what they're doing in real time or as recorded, what you're actually seeing is their problem solving ability, which is really what people should be based on if you're looking to fill those kind of positions. With chatbots, what this goes to is this idea of eliminating noise. The chatbot will ask the same 12 questions of every applicant and will not get distracted by the answer to go off on a side question, if that humans often do, because when somebody answers a question, they want to know more. Or if they say, you know, I went to the University of Texas, they want to share that they also went to the University of Texas. The neuroscience games I already discussed. One of the benefits to the neuroscience games is it's not just applying for a single job, but you can apply to whichever jobs are open that you're suited for in a company. So this way people, it isn't like a yes or no, it's more like, let's find the right match for you if there is one. And what this does for companies, which is the big benefit to using these consultants, or else deciding that you will develop this in-house, is that you get better applicants, and the ones you bring in are better suited for what you're trying to do. It also, as I mentioned, can locate non-traditional applicants, people you might not find if you're only engaging in on-campus interviews. But again, one of the side effects that has resulted in all of these new companies engaging in this field are you get more diverse applicants. So I want to talk a little bit about the risks, because when you read the legal scholarship, most of the time what they're really focusing on is the danger of using AI in certain fields, including the field of employment. And what I've done is I've divided them into two categories. One is the garbage in, garbage out. And this is if you feed it biased data, you get biased results. And the other is the black box. And one of the speakers spoke about this earlier, but this is the concern that you don't know why a decision is made by the machine. You don't know exactly what the machine learning process took into account and didn't take into account. So everyone always asks about this, so I'm going to address it up front on the slide. And that is, I'm sure you've heard about the whole Amazon debacle. So Amazon had a group of programmers who obviously are trained in developing algorithms. And they said, well, you know what? Let's make it easy for our company. We are going to develop an algorithm that's going to pick the perfect employee. So you have a very homogeneous group of programmers get together, they develop the algorithm, and what the algorithm does is it teaches itself to discard every single resume submitted by a woman. And what it was doing was, even if a woman's resume, you couldn't tell from the name whether it was a man or woman, said something like they belong to the Women's Computer Science Club, which you would think, wow, that's a plus for this job, it would discard it. And a lot of people point to that example as saying, yeah, AI is bad, don't use it for employment. But what they fail to take into account is this is exactly what you'd expect if you feed a machine a set of resumes of people that Amazon hired, when 90% of the people they hired were white males. That is what the machine taught itself. This is the preferred employee. So it discarded all of the female resumes. And it really, the programmers couldn't figure out how to fix it. So they just discarded the whole program. What probably would have been a better choice is to bring in a group of diverse programmers to kind of sit down and figure out what's going on. So solutions to garbage in, garbage out. These are just a few of them. One is clean your data. Find data sets that actually work for what you're trying to do. Definitely don't use data brokers. Don't scrape the internet. They tend to be error prone. They tend to reflect societal prejudices and correct unbalanced data. And this is what Amazon should have done. So there are a number of ways that you can do this. One is called boosting, another is called reduction. Had the Amazon programmers, before they fed these resumes into the algorithm they developed, done either of those things, they probably would have gotten a different result. So boosting, as it sounds like, would be to duplicate the females' resumes so that it was a 50-50 split, or reduction, meaning reduce the resumes from the males so it was a 50-50 split, or do some combination of both so the machine didn't think there was a big preference for males. And then, of course, diverse programmers. So there's so many places where the lack of diversity in the programmers can come into play to add bias. This includes the labeling, it includes the creation of the algorithm, and it includes the actual looking at the results. I also pose some solutions to the black box problem. I'm just going to mention two of them. There's many more in my paper, but one of them is called quantitative input influence. And this one I kind of like a lot. So the machine can't explain its decision. It's not set up to do that, but there are ways to have the machine print out a list of the factors it looked at in the order of importance. And what this does is if you look at this list and you see that it is race is the number one thing it was considering, you have a good indication that this is not an appropriate algorithm. The other is counterfactual fairness testing, and this is more like auditing. So what you do is you run the same program, one without protected factors. So in other words, you've cleaned out all the gender, race, anything you don't want it to consider, but then you run the algorithm a second time, including those factors. If you get the same result, you know you have a fair algorithm. If you're getting a different result, you know that they're considering things they should not. Okay, it looks like my time is almost up. Just real quickly, these legal issues have not been addressed. We do not have any major cases on the books addressing this. We are just now starting to see states pass some of these laws. So Illinois is at the forefront of this. They have the Artificial Intelligence Video Interview Act, which requires consent. They also have one of the strongest biometric laws on the books, which again requires consent. And then California has their law on privacy, which requires consent. And then I've just done a list of some of the other issues I've written about related to privacy and artificial intelligence. So thank you.
Thank you so very much. I think this is a really good kind of segue point because it really works very well with Bob's presentation. So that's why I had, I thought these two presentations would really work well together. Bob, are you ready to take it away?
That's a great question. My suggestion would be, in case I'm not, why don't we let Art go ahead and do his, and then
All right.
Dave, I'll kind of finish up at the end, and hopefully I won't have any challenges.
All right, I can do that. Can you guys all hear me? Am I good to go?
You're good to go.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen, but I only have 4 slides. So if it doesn't work, then I'll cut bait. Okay, do you guys all got it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
All right, cool. So I'm going to talk about artificial intelligence and criminal justice and how these two things can be amazing and super, super scary. Kimberly just talked about the dangers that people have reported and done research on as it relates to underwriting. But what happens if the dangers are something a lot more stiff, like higher bail, higher sentences, or studies have shown that in some jurisdictions where a judge didn't have dinner, lunch, the bail was higher in his courtroom than after lunch. These are the types of dangers that decision making by our judicial players have. I mean, the potential application of artificial intelligence in the criminal justice system is really exciting. I'm going to talk about how it's scary as well. because ultimately our current protocols and decision-making processes fail us, and they fail us a lot. And they fail us across the spectrum as relates to race, poverty, and other factors that we, as a society say are important to us. Over the last 20 years, we have seen just a huge growth in the number of incarcerated individuals in the United States. And this is leading many people to this conclusion that the nature of justice is in jeopardy, and also not to mention the cost to our taxpayers. So, algorithms being used, and, listen, I'm not a tech person, so I know that I probably am not accurate in, my language when it relates to algorithms and AI, but I'm just a federal prosecutor and police officer who got into academics. So please excuse my misusage. But this is not new. People act like this is some kind of groundbreaking thing that has happened in law enforcement and in criminal justice, but it really isn't. I mean, we talked about predictive policing and people scream and yell how this is awful, how can we do this? But we've been doing predictive policing forever. I mean, since Sir Robert Peel, invented the idea of policing, we had this idea of a sergeant would sit behind a desk and kind of map out where that was happening and push resources towards that. And in '84, Congress passed the Sentencing Reform Act. And it basically created a sentencing guideline that looked like a grid. And so the government turned that grid and made it mechanical and automated it for use. Now, the Supreme Court came back in the Booker case and held that the mandatory aspects of the guidelines were unconstitutional. So the government stopped using this system called applied sentencing system. And funny enough, just for people who are curious, after the Booker case came out, sentences actually got worse for defendants after the fact, because of kind of the things that we're going to talk about, that we just don't make great decisions as it relates to criminal justice, that our ideas of justice have failed us systemically throughout our country. So, many of the things that AI is used is the biggest area is in risk assessments. And many risk assessment algorithms are used to aid or even replace bail schedules. And, they've had pretty good results. Today there are as many as 60 different risk assessments algorithms used across this country. They are used into a quasi AI system that is supposed to learn from itself and come better solutions. But one of the things that we have found in our research on algorithms in criminal justice is, to be effective, any risk assessment tool has to be validated, and validation requires confirming that the items, risk scores, risk categories, and the tools have been statistically significant and a relationship to recidivism or whatever we're measuring, and using fresh sample of cases rather than the sample that was used in the first place, which happens quite often, is the way to validate. A risk assessment tool becomes more reliable the more validation tests that are conducted. But still, 48% of pretrial programs in this country have never validated itself, even though that we know for a fact that without validation, it isn't a very good tool. And remember, the consequences aren't inconsistent results in underwriting. It's people being sentenced and individuals being held over for trial when they probably didn't need to. Reasons for this include lack of standard method for validations and the expense associated with validation. So, as one example, New Jersey opted to use public safety assessment tool, which was something designed by the Arnold Foundation. It's currently used in 38 jurisdictions. It's one of the most popular risk assessment algorithms AI is used. And they basically ended cash bail with the risk assessment algorithm. And this led to a 20% reduction in pretrial population. That's amazing. That is great news. Except while we saw a drop in the population with no significant increase in crime, which was, again, excellent. Before the algorithm was in place, Black men made up 94% of New Jersey jails. And guess what that percentage was after the algorithm was used? Yep, 54%. Did I say 94? I meant to say 54%. 54% before, 54% after, even though black men only make up 7% of the population in New Jersey. So exactly what Kimberly said, garbage in, garbage out. So, what are the constitutional legal considerations? Well, any criminal justice reform must account for due process, equal protection, and measures. They must strive to be unbiased, transparent, balanced, and fair, and pass, our basic constitutional protections. The Brady Doctrine is something that people have been very cleverly trying to use under Brady. Of course, we know that anything that's exculpatory or can be used under Giglio to impeach a witness has to be turned over. Several appellate courts have held that this includes algorithms in some settings, especially at pretrial. But remember, defendants don't have no right to discovery before bail hearing. So the damage often is done. And somebody who's been a federal prosecutor for 9 years, prosecutors in this country use the pressure of detention in order to get plea bargains. And once you plea, it's game over. So the Brady Doctrine is not really likely to have a huge impact. And this is something we should reform. If it's a society, we say we test justice with the tension of the adversarial system, then everybody must be on equal footing. Equal protection clause is something that we've been looking at. If the risk assessment tools considered certain classifications, race, gender, etc., then equal protection claims should be raised. But again, and I'm going to say a little bit, because of transparency, it's sometimes hard to get to that. It's hard to make an equal protection case when you don't actually know what's going on. So basis, bias plus implicit or explicit decision-making, although a judge's internal mental balance of competing factors is largely invisible to outsiders, a risk assessment makes its balancing decisions transparent and quantifiable. And I'm going to point out in a second how sometimes that doesn't happen, but that is one good thing that we can point to when it comes to AI and criminal justice. There's a case that people should read if they're interested in this. It's Loomis versus Wisconsin. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court limited matters for which risk assessments can be used to consider relevant factors like diverting low-risk individuals, and there was a total of 3 different factors. But they basically shot down the assessment was being used because the results were so categorically unfair. Okay, so how can it discriminates? One of the things, algorithms are opinions, and this is something that I've heard a lot, and it's really true. Algorithms are just opinions that have been translated into code. And this is something that, Professor Hauser just, talked about so graciously, is that, it cannot transcend fairness if we don't know exactly what's going on. In fact, the precise objective of an algorithm is to have a goal, or they would be pointless. The goal is the outcome desired. And if you put in, again, I love that line, garbage in, garbage out. If you put in garbage and your goal is garbage, then that's exactly what you're going to get on the back end. Algorithm bias and fairness, for bias can occur through improper analysis of data at the selection variables. The algorithms seek to optimize. And there's also concern that data, AI learning is tainted in its very sense, which raises the probability that it could perpetuate and exacerbate inequality. And we actually have evidence of that. There was a 2016 study that assessed the level of racist bias in the risk assessment software Compass, and concluded that based on outcomes in Broward County alone, Black defendants were far more likely than white defendants to be incorrectly incarcerated at pretrial at a higher rate, and judged of having a higher rate of recidivism. And this is like Minority Report kind of stuff. They're basically saying that we predict that you're going to commit crime in the future, and the computer is doing that, which at least in Minority Report, it was, we had voodoo science. Leads me to another major area is lack of transparency. Of course, on the business side, we want to protect our algorithms because it's worth money. But when you're talking about freedom and liberty, you really run into problems. Many have criticized the lack of public accountability and transparency in the inner workings of algorithms, especially which inform just judicial decisions. So better transparency can lead to better discovery and rectify the algorithmic basis. So the use of sensible variables is something that we already heard about. Some systems examine risk factors about an individual's case, and other examples look at other factors like gender, family history, violence. These risk assessments are going to have more slanted results. The human-machine interface era. This specifically refers to judges. And by the way, this is the thing that I have seen in my research as being the most profound. And it's kind of silly when you get down to it, because it's how judges interact with those systems, because we can put judges in basically two categories. Either they ignore the findings totally, which is no good. What's the point of having it if they're going to be ignored? Or they just rely on it no matter what, taking the recommendation for detention, ignoring other recommendations for release. So in many times where AI was supposed to help individuals, it actually ended up hurting individuals, because judges, if it says to detain, judges detain. And if it says don't detain, they detain, because they don't trust the system. So you end up with a damned if you do, damned if you don't type of scenario. So what are some of the solutions that we can look at? Well, I think that we need to make exceptions to intellectual property law, because we need to have transparency about what is actually involved in these algorithms. I know this is complicated because of money, and there's a lot of cost involved, but open source procurement, the Arnold Foundation system allows for, it's an open source, so you can actually see what's going on. I think human interaction and training, ensuring that judges have the proper training. Many times I have found that judges don't get proper training, helping judges understand the disparities. Listen, there's very few judges sitting around in corners twiddling their fingers, muhaha, how can I keep people detained unconstitutionally? Does it happen? I'm sure it does, but it's pretty rare. Most judges want to know about the disparities. And here's another problem is we talk a lot about proximity in the criminal justice system, but we never talk about proximity at the right points. Like, judges aren't proximate to their decisions down the road, especially as relates to jail. We know the individuals that are detained have a higher chance of committing crime than they otherwise would have had, primarily because they're put in impossible situations. I think that, I'll end with this, is that this has the potential of having, incredible benefits to our society, of leveling the playing field, incarcerate more people than anyone else in the world. And we are not better for it. I'm a libertarian. I want to privatize sidewalks. And if you look at the way that we spend money in the criminal justice system for the results we get, it is an enormous waste. And if we can turn to artificial intelligence and algorithms and help have a more fair system, I'm all for it. I think as a policy, we should all for it. I think as the law should reinforce that. But there's a lot of dangers that we need to be eyes wide open about. And one of the things that I have found, and I'm sure anybody who's worked in the government knows, is that change is really, really hard. But that's the thing that you need most when you're talking about AI. There is a reason that that industry, leads the way on this, is cutting edge, is because they are nimble. They have the ability to shift gears really quickly. That is not the case when it comes to the government. When a county embeds a algorithm and an AI system as it relates to bail, for instance, into their system, it is really hard to change it. So it has to be as good as we can possibly get it before it's implemented, because once it's implemented, it is really hard to change gears. And that's true with anything when you're talking about the government. So I'm really excited to be here, and I'm learning a lot. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. And I think we have a lot of interesting overlap with Kimberly's paper to think about in terms of the notes that I had that were really interesting points of departure for our discussion later on, was sort of the garbage in, garbage out problem, and the problem of, what do we do with the algorithm itself as an opinion? I think these were themes that came out loud and clear from different perspectives in both presentations. Bob, are you good to go now, or should we have David go first?
I'll let David go ahead and go.
All right, David, are you good?
Yes, I am. I think. Let's. All right, can we all see that? Can you see my slides?
It's blank at the moment. It says started screen sharing. Ah, there they are. Yep.
Okay, so you should have my cover slide up there. Is that what you're seeing?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, my name's David Rubenstein. I'm so glad to be on this panel. So many interesting things. I already have so many questions. I hope we'll have some time to get to some of them. My presentation today is titled Acquiring Ethical AI, which is the title of a forthcoming law review article that I'm working on. Just to sort of give a background setup, I think we all understand, I won't spend a lot of time on it, talking about how ubiquitous artificial intelligence is. It's permeated basically every single market in every corner of our lives. We've also talked about how AI under the right conditions can be a wonderful tool, could solve and detect problems. It can make industry or governments or judges more efficient, more effective. It could reduce and rectify human error and bias. But under the wrong conditions, AI can create new problems, and AI can efficiently and effectively cause harm. Right, so I just want to pause here to say something about that, because people can make mistakes too. And I think we're going to hear more about, we've heard about, Kimberly was talking about heuristics and biases, and people are imperfect. And then we heard about judges making mistakes. And the thing about AI is the scalability issue. So if you have, for example, a really let's say a biased or an inefficient judge who in 100 cases, gets 20% wrong, that's 20 people who are potentially harmed. Whereas you have an AI decision-making system that's doing 100,000 cases, and that's only 10% wrong, well, you still have 1,000 people whose lives might be negatively impacted. And so the scaling problem is something that's really important that I don't think we heard much about today. And then finally, these AI systems can reify and amplify human error and bias. So we've heard garbage in, garbage out, but some people also say bias in, bias out. And I hope we'll have some time to talk about some of the problems that go beyond just the bad data that could cause bad outcomes, because it's a lot more complex than that. So my focus today is algorithmic governance, which is the government's use of artificial intelligence. So, and I'm really going to be focusing on the federal government's use of artificial intelligence. And so in law enforcement, so the FBI is using facial recognition, for example, in law enforcement. Department of Homeland Security is using it for immigration enforcement and for border surveillance. Social Security is using it to adjudicate Social Security benefits. It's being used, or at least being piloted, for regulatory analysis. So it's being used basically to carry out just about every conceivable government function. It's also being used for customer service, like in chat boxes. When trying to get some help from the government, you may now be talking to a chat box. It could also, could be really efficient in allocating resources. And of course, the elephant in the room is national security, which I'm probably not going to speak a lot about, but it is important to understand that artificial intelligence is permeating our national security infrastructures, and it's being used for war fighting. And in many ways, it's an important thing to understand, because it drives a lot of the market, both inside and outside of the government, for this technology. So to just sort of hone in a little bit more on my subject for my talk today, it's algorithmic government, it's the government's use of AI, but really it's the government's ethical use of AI. So you could call it ethical algorithmic governance. So a couple of years ago, it's only been in the last couple of years where artificial intelligence has really catapulted to the forefront of the global agenda. 10 years ago, before deep learning and some of these new technologies, and before the Internet of Things got as big as it did, it's really a fringe subject. But now it is something that ranks really highly across the geopolitical landscape. In 2019, the United States helped prepare and then backed a set of artificial intelligence principles for international sort of sign-on, and then the G20 quickly signed on, and many other countries have these ethical principles that they've now pledged their commitment to all across the globe. And then all the major tech companies, Google, Amazon, IBM, just to name a few, Microsoft, they all have their own sort of ethical codes and ethical frameworks, plus all the small startups and nonprofits and NGOs. There's more than 80 sort of ethical AI frameworks that are now percolating. And they all sort of, they're all a little different, obviously, but they all kind of coalesce around these set of ideas here about fair and impartiality, that AI systems should be transparent and accountable and safe, and we have privacy considerations. They need to be robust against adversarial attack. They need to be reliable. They need to be accurate. And so this is just a pretty good representation about really where a lot of the principles are coalescing. But of course, proselytizing is not actualizing. And the next major step for industry, for governments around the globe, is how to translate these ethical principles into practice. And that is not an easy thing to do. And so to put it a little bit differently, if there's a widespread agreement that AI systems should be fair, well, then how do we turn that sort of principle into some sort of a legal requirement or some sort of a norm? And same thing with privacy and explainability and so on and so forth. And that's really at that sort of juncture that we're at right now. And it's going to be happening in the next, really soon, very near future. I think there's more than 50 bills that are now currently pending in Congress that would touch on artificial intelligence and its uses, and either both in the private sector and in the government. So this is happening. And then a little bit more specifically, so I'm talking about the ethical use of artificial intelligence by the government, and then my specific focus on procurement law, federal procurement law. Now, a lot of you, probably most of you, are not very familiar with this area of law, and you don't need to know all of the details, certainly for purposes of today's discussion. But in general, it's the body of law that governs the federal government's purchase of goods and services from the private markets. And in this context, we're talking about the government's purchase of AI tools and AI services from the tech industry. So, putting all these ideas together, algorithmic governance, ethical AI, and federal procurement law is what my article's about. And this is where I get the title, Acquiring Ethical AI. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about all of these things as listed here. With regard to the government's use of technologies, well, I guess I should back up, is that in general, we expect the government to act in transparent, accountable, and fair ways. But these norms of good government pose major challenges for AI systems, right? Because they tend to be notoriously opaque. They are not accountable, in part because they're not transparent, so we don't understand how they're working. And so it's hard to know who to hold accountable and for what. And this issue of fairness, it's a difficult, because how do you define fair? But it can lead to discrimination. It could lead to a focus or disproportionate effects on marginalized or poor communities, for example. And AI systems pose major challenges across the board. So it's one thing when this is occurring in the private market, right? This is why we need to regulate the private market. But we have to take a step back, because the expectations should be different, and they are different when it comes to the government. So as much as we might expect the private sector to be using transparent, accountable, and fair algorithms, we certainly expect that from the government. But as it stands, our legal system has not been coded, so to speak, forgive the pun, for AI. And so the challenge is how to make the law and the technology fit. And so there's two general approaches to that. Number one, you could tinker with the technology, and you could tinker with the law, and most approaches do a little bit of both. So for example, from taking it from the technology side, the AXI is acronym or a shorthand for explainable AI. So in some ways, this is a byproduct of the fact that AI systems are so inscrutable. The complexity of them exceeds human understanding, so much so that even the designers, the people who create these algorithms, do not understand how they get from input to output, right? You know what the input is, you know what the output is, but how the sort of the mechanisms, the mathematical functions that translate input to output is so complex, is sort of way beyond human understanding. And so then you have these separate algorithms that are then going to explain to humans, or essentially dumbing it down for humans so that they can understand how the system is working. So this is an example of a technological fix. Then you have all sorts of data science techniques that's like works with new testing and validation, and computer scientists and developers trying to formalize mathematically definitions of fairness. And as I indicated in the morning session in one of my questions, I think there's more than 20 definitions of fairness right now, and that sort of mathematically anyway, which is not totally unsurprising, because when you think about it, because if you think about how do we think about fairness, well, it depends on which philosophy, which ideology you follow. I mean, we have so many different conceptions of fairness. The difference is that in computer science, they're trying to formalize it mathematically, and that's a point I'd like to try to remember to come back to later, but it's really not my focus right now. When it comes to the law, there's been a lot of attention of late with regard to constitutional law, for example, because of the bias that could lead to discrimination, and then you're talking about equal protection. Because of the inscrutability of these mechanisms, because they're hard to explain if we could understand them at all, that runs into due process concerns, right? Because how do you have a fair hearing if you don't understand how these systems are being used against you? With regard to the Fourth Amendment search and seizure, with all the surveillance, the facial recognition, and so on and so forth. So tons of constitutional law issues. With regard to administrative law, there's questions about delegation of authority. I mean, because of agencies are essentially using AI, then like where's the expertise that's being delegated to agencies, but also some doctrinal questions like arbitrary and capricious review and hard look review. And I know that one of our law students, Zach Smith, is working on some questions about administrative law, and lots of writing about data and privacy. But the piece that's missing, or that I hope my article will begin to fill, is procurement law. You know, it's like, where's procurement law in all this, and why does it matter? And that's what really I'm focusing on in this article. Here's the thing. The government does not have the in-house workforce to meet its high demand for artificial intelligence. Which means that the AI software and services is going to be procured by contract, if not, certainly a lot of it, if not most of it. And so I call this like the outsourcing of algorithmic governance. And one reaction, and it's a fair one, is, well, okay, so what? And there's actually a lot of concerns with this, at least some that I'd like to point out. The first is, this is just a rough flow chart of how these AI systems, machine learning in particular, are developed. We're definitely not going to have time to talk in detail. But the point is that there's a lot that goes on in the process of developing these AI technologies, as one can imagine. And essentially, the federal government is going to be acquiring unregulated technology, because the technology, at least to date, isn't regulated in the private market. So the federal government is procuring these tools from the private market. The federal government is using unregulated technology. And so, and perhaps it's not a fair analogy, but it's one that came to mind just this morning. It's as if the government was buying like vaccines that weren't tested, you know, because this stuff isn't regulated, and that's a problem. Another problem is, even when we get the regulation, it depends on what the regulation is, that these AI systems are embedded with value-laden trade-offs. And what I mean by that, essentially, there's policy choices which are equivalent to political type choices, the things that reasonable people will disagree about, the types of things that are embedded in these technologies, like what's technologically feasible, what's socially acceptable, what's economical, what's legally permissible, and how to you have to make trade-offs sometimes between these things. And as I mentioned, AI systems can defy these governance norms of accountability, transparency, and so on and so forth. So getting back to, big picture, you essentially, if the federal government's buying these technologies from the private market that's unregulated and being created by private industries whose values may differ from those of the government or the people it serves, that's a problem. To the limited extent that procurement law has been addressed in the literature, it's been to the problem, to the types of problems that I've just described. And what I want to do is sort of present the positive case for procurement law, because if we don't do anything, then essentially the federal government is going to be sort of getting all this technology into the government and using it, and that's a dangerous thing. But so what we need to do is rethink procurement law in the same way that we have to rethink constitutional law and administrative law and privacy law. We need to think procurement law. That's what I'm trying to do in this article. I conceive of sort of the procurement gateway, which is like connecting the technology industry to the federal government. And usually, it's fair to say that the technology, or even just the industrial base or federal contractors, don't really want more regulation in general. I mean, businesses don't want more regulation. They don't want more hoops to jump through when it comes to federal contracting, because it's already it's already a Byzantine system. So I have to sort of make the pragmatic case for why the types of reforms that I'm going to call for are palatable. And the reason why it's palatable goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that the world over, federal governments, states, organizations, but the technology companies themselves are clamoring for some ethical principles, in part because, and the motivations might differ, but it is critical for there to be trust, widespread public trust in these technologies, or no one's going to buy them. It's critical that there be widespread trust in these technologies, or we're going to rebel against our government who's trying to use them. And so despite the motivational differences, awful AI doesn't sell. It doesn't sell politically, it doesn't sell commercially. And so this is sort of the mutual interest that brings the technology industry and the government together in the procurement gateway. So this is just a flow chart of, I really wasn't keeping track of my time, Freddie. Am I over? Well over?
About 2 minutes over.
Okay, I'll do this just in 1 minute then. Thank you. This is just like sort of when government enters into contracts, there's a planning phase, they send out bids and solicitations, they issue contract awards, and then there's sort of, you have to oversee the contract to make sure that the contractor's doing what they're doing. And so this is the general procurement cycle, and my prescriptions sort of map onto this cycle. So I call for AI risk assessments, which is during the planning phase to require federal agencies to catalog and identify the foreseeable risks and the mitigation strategies, and that these risk assessments should be prepared by a multidisciplinary and ideally a very diverse team of individuals so they could spot the risks and the challenges, and that it be signed by the federal government, by the project manager, so that there's some accountability for the types of problems and the types of solutions that AI is going to be put to use for. And then through this risk assessment, the benefits could go to the sort of the solicitation process where the government goes out and solicits bids. The idea here, all the details, or many more of the details will be in my paper, but the big idea is to create competition around ethical AI, because unless and until we have standards for what fairness means or transparency means, what you could do in the solicitation process is have these tech companies compete against each other to prove that theirs is fairer than the next, that theirs is more transparent than the next, right? So you make these questions of ethical AI, you build it into the solicitation process, then create a focal point for competition. And then the government can award contracts. Of course, price will matter, technical capabilities will matter. What I'm suggesting is that as a matter of law, ethical AI will always be relevant in any procurement of AI technologies. And so as a matter of law, it should always be considered at least one of the factors that go into the selection of which technology vendors to use for a particular solution. Okay, I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting to kind of see this approach in light of what we heard before, because it really added a more critical responsibility lens over the problems and the opportunities that we had seen in the first two presentations. So Bob, let me turn it back to you to sort of add yet another lens, the emotional lens and AI to heuristics and bias. And take it away, please.
Let me see if I can get my screen up this time.
Excellent.
That's not it. Well, you know what? I just don't know what's going on with this technology, so I'm just going to kind of talk through it with you all, and hopefully we can make this work. So as I mentioned, we've got several different concepts here. We've got artificial emotion intelligence, emotion recognition, affect recognition, emotion AI, effective computing, all different terms that you'll see here. And there was a great book written by an author. She's a professor at MIT, Rosalind Picard, and she's the one who really came up with this particular area of artificial intelligence called artificial emotion intelligence. And you know, the latest scientific findings indicate that emotions play really an essential role in decision making, perception, learning, and more. And that is, they influence the very mechanisms of rational thinking. Not only too much, but too little emotion can impair decision making. And according to Rosalind Picard, if we want computers to be genuinely intelligent and interact naturally with us, we must give computers the ability to recognize, understand, even to express emotions. And so, you know, we look at how do we interact with one another. You look at people's faces, you look at their bodies, and you change your interaction accordingly. You know, an artificial intelligence, rapidly evolving, but building a machine that can perceive emotion, emotional signals, is distinct from teaching a machine to interpret them. And expressing emotion is yet another task. You know, in a machine, you can decouple capabilities, train it to recognize anger, but give it no feelings. You can go pretty far with this, making it perceive or even express emotions, but without the actual feelings. So, you know, the task of designing and integrating artificial moral decision-making is really complicated by our still evolving understanding of how the human moral decision-making actually works. So, you know, many moral judgments begin with intuitions, relatively fast, automatic, effective responses, and are supported only after the fact with reasoning that is kind of backfilled to fit the moral judgment already reached on the basis of unconscious factors. So emotions really provide the important channels for acquiring information relevant to moral decision making. And you know, the human ability to intuit the affective states of others, whether it's pain, fear, surprise, humiliation, anger, disgust, or another emotion, is really essential to our ability to direct one's actions in an appropriate way. It just kind of give you a little food for thought here. Think about the judge who has to decide an Eighth Amendment case and concluding that executing juveniles is cruel and unusual, obviously imploring or imposing upon their moral compass in many regards. So how does this all take place with artificial intelligence? Well, you know, there are sensors being developed that can find patterns and correlations between emotion and heart rate, perspiration, patterns of speech, directions of gaze, body language, your pupil dilation, the frequency of messages sent, and the quickness of the responses. So these are all coming into play when you're evaluating how to react to someone. Cognitive psychologists have long documented these heuristics and biases in human decision making that reflect or lead to shortcuts in judgments. And these decisions tend to deviate systematically from those that rational decision making would predict. And I know you can't see it, but I've got a picture of Mr. Spock from Star Trek up here, and probably the preeminent individual who cabins off the emotions from his logical thinking. Traditionally, discussions of law and the emotions portray emotions as a counterpart to rational thought. Emotion has typically been viewed as a corruptive force that distorts logical reasoning. And this mechanistic view is arguably the prevailing view in American law. Emotion is wholly distinct from cognition and has to be carefully separated so that it does not bias or influence logic and rational reasoning. The ability to connect and perceive with deep empathy gives a clear advantage in a world where more of our success depends on influencing other people. Emotion intelligence is a hard to teach skill, but one that it hasn't been programmable into technology until now, I'm told. They're starting to move into that capability. And concurrent with progress on AI in the last 2 decades, emotional intelligence has been developed significantly with advances in neuroscience tools such as the functional magnetic resonance imaging. Come a long way in that area. Shifting the topic a little bit, the role of the jury in the United States really is, at least according to the Supreme Court, jurors are presumed to be fitted for determining the weight and credibility of witness testimony by their natural intelligence and their practical knowledge of men and the ways of men. And the fundamental premise in our criminal system is that the jury is the lie detector. Does the public necessarily believe in the jury's ability to determine fabrication of the truth? Is it still safe to say that in the age of DNA-based convictions and exonerations that lie detecting is what juries do best? There was a study done by Dr. Bruce Spencer at Northwestern University, and he revealed through his research that juries wrongfully convict in about 13% of cases. When they err, they do so more asymmetrically. They're more likely to convict an innocent person than to acquit a guilty person. So the role of the jury, judges and juries bring different skill sets and life experiences to their roles. Juries, on the other hand, have the benefit of pooling their education and experience, which maximizes their collective recollection and comprehension of the evidence and minimizes the possibility that biases held by any one juror will inappropriately skew the jury's interpretation of the evidence. But again, going back to Dr. Bruce's study, 13%, still a substantial percentage of the population that's wrongfully convicted. Some would undoubtedly argue that the attribute of the humanness of the judge has to be infused, if we're going to be looking at AI and emotional intelligence, has to be infused with the technology so that it plays a principled role in advancing a responsive justice system. At least one MIT professor of artificial intelligence has postulated that due to the interplay of the brain's frontal lobe and the limbic system, our ability to reason and to weigh the value of information depends in part on our ability to feel emotion. So hence the issue of, do we need to infuse that emotional artificial intelligence into our systems? One of the things that I think Art had talked about, and let me just discuss this in a little bit more detail. There was a study done of over 1,100 parole board hearings in Israeli prisons. And over a 10-month period, that revealed that the odds that the prisoners will be successfully paroled off start fairly high at around 65% and quickly plummet to nothing over a few hours. After the judges have returned from their breaks, the odds abruptly climb back up to about 65% before resuming their downward trend. A prisoner's fate really could hinge upon the point in the day when their case is heard. So when it comes to parole hearings, the default choice is to deny the prisoner's request. The more decisions a judge has made, the more drained they are and the more likely they are to make default choices. Taking a break replenishes them. My last slide that you can't see here, unfortunately, is one that indicates there's more. Now, I'll just say here, I am a mess. And I think it's probably fair to say that many of us are, because there are more than 180 cognitive biases that have been identified. And I go to my primary resource tool, and that is Wikipedia, and you can actually look them up. And I find that I probably have quite a few of these. So I think there's a long way to go before artificial intelligence can be properly infused with unbiased behavior from we humans. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Freddie.
Thank you so much. A fascinating presentation that really brought a lot of what, the distinction between human judging and machine judging into relief. So what I would like to do is, I'm sort of keeping an eye on the chat. If there are audience questions, if you can type them in the chat, then I can try to introduce them here. Before I have a few questions, but before I do that, David, you'd mentioned that you had a few questions as well. Let me just simply set you loose and then set you guys loose on each other.
I mean, I don't even know where to start. I have, now you go first. You go. What do you have, Freddie? Because I want it to be for everybody. Everybody can answer.
So one of the questions that kind of kept coming up for me was that when you have a human making a decision, if we make the distinction between human and machine, the human at least is clearly responsible for their actions. And so in a legal paradigm, it's reasonably straightforward to ascribe legal responsibility and liability or other regulatory consequences when it's humans making decisions. What I kind of heard throughout the conversation throughout the afternoon was this is really not as clear cut when it's machines, right? Because we can say, well, it's the input that did it. So the user is the one that is really responsible. Well, it might be the algorithm itself, because the algorithm really is a kind of opinion, and then it scales its own opinion up. So it's the algorithm that is responsible. So if we're looking for a person that is responsible and should face liability, it's not the user, it's the maker of the algorithm. And you could kind of keep pushing this onward. So I wanted to explore that with you a little bit more about, well, if we have to impose liability, if we have to impose regulatory burdens, where do we impose them in order to achieve better results? Because it seems that the result fundamentally changes where you do, and there's a certain amount of fluidity in the context of AI that isn't there in the context of human cognition.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there was a speaker this morning, I don't remember which one, that was talking about issues with self-driving cars, I believe. And what they had mentioned is that there's probably going to be a whole new insurance industry. And I think that's probably the way we're going because of the difficulty And where do you assign the liability when there's multiple areas for the error or discriminatory results to come in? Because it could be in the data, could be with the labeling of the data, it could be with the formation of the algorithm, or it could be from the machine learning, which does not have human input. So I think we're probably going to go the way of insurance. So with self-driving cars, for example, it would most likely be the owner, whoever chooses to purchase that self-driving car will be ultimately responsible, and therefore there would be a new type of insurance. With things like with employment decision-making, that's kind of a different issue. And I'll tell you, I've done a fair amount of research on, you know, when you're using these kind of automated processes, how do you assign, you know, how do you show that there's been a discriminatory result if you don't know why the algorithm produced the result? So I think that is going to be an area of law that's going to have to develop in that specific field.
So that would be a really helpful way to address it kind of in the private sector, where insurance really can come in and you can make people whole and you can have responsibility results that are monetary. So, you know, we're going to make the victim whole monetarily through an insurance result. Pushing back a little bit on that, and maybe Art, you could come in here. How does that work in the government context? And I mean, I had a conversation to prepare for today with one of my colleagues, Professor Craig Martin, and he recently had a podcast episode on JibJab where he's working on, you know, autonomous weapon systems. And so the question was, an autonomous weapon system commits a war crime. Who's responsible for the war crime? And so, you know, that would be kind of this question on steroids in the government setting. But I think that kind of, you know, who do we hold responsible in the criminal justice setting to the extent that AI reaches a result that we consider to be, in hindsight, to have been incorrect?
I think that's probably going to be a constitutional law issue. You know, the same way that judges, they have immunity for their decisions, but if there is, for example, a prosecutor engages in conduct that violates the Constitution, there can be the person who's put in jail wrongly can file a habeas corpus petition based on the Constitution. I'm guessing that's what would probably happen with an algorithmic error that results in somebody being put in jail wrongly, or unreasonable bail amount, or any of those others.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of depends on the context. If you, like in Michigan, for example, they had an automated decision-making system for unemployment benefits. It was a terrible system that they put in place. It just was poorly designed, and it created tons of financial harm to the people that were denied unemployment benefits by this algorithm or algorithmic system. And it's monetary damages, and this, you know, to the extent that there's been a waiver of, you know, sovereign liability, if it's a state or the federal government, there can be monetary liability. There could also be injunctions to stop the use of that technology. And, you know, when you talk about liability in the government context, it's not always liability in the monetary sense or the compensatory sense. It's often in the injunction sense, where we could either vote for laws that prohibit, let's say, facial recognition, right? Or that prohibit certain types of technologies, or that if there's a technology being used to dole out veterans benefits that turns out to be either inscrutable or unusable, then you can't use it anymore. It's like a regulatory policy that gets struck down because you can't use it anymore. And so it sort of depends on the context. What I want to sort of say about procurement law, which I didn't have time to say, and it's sort of a pitch. First of all, procurement law is not the solution. I didn't get a chance to say that. It's part of the package. You need to have all of these things in place. But what's interesting and potentially useful about procurement law is it has something that those other regulatory levers don't, which is spending power. It's right. So if you use procurement law, it's a sort of a carrot. you're not really using sticks in the same way. You are creating competition within the industry to earn, millions and billions of dollars of government contracts by proving that they could be responsible and fair and have, effective algorithms. And so again, that's what makes it sort of a nice counterpart or complement to some of the other regulatory tools that are still undeveloped. But when they do get developed, I think the procurement will be a big part of it.
I got one question from the audience. And so the question that I got from our audience is, do any of the panel members foresee a time when we accept that AI has biases, but allow it because it has or potentially has less bias than the human that would otherwise be making the decision or perform the same task?
Yeah. That's a really excellent question. It goes down, that's a common question and a really important one. So kudos to the person who asked it. Yeah, right, what's our baseline? What are we comparing these systems to? So those who promote and champion the use of AI, and let's, in the government sector at least, the concern is we're putting too high of a standard on AI if we're comparing it to how a human would do by themselves. And that is something we haven't worked out either. What is the benchmarking that we're going to apply as a civilization or society when we judge these systems, decide how well they do? And that's a hard one to crack. Some would say that it doesn't just have to be better than humans, it has to be a lot better than humans, because that's the promise of AI, right? That it's going to be so much better than humans. Because if it's the same as humans and just taking jobs away, then we're going to reject it. Right? It's got to be somewhat better. And in most cases, it's not going to be a complete displacement. It's going to be an augmentation. It's going to be how does a human plus a computer working together? I think of like the chess players. They got the computer going, but you have the human, and together they're so much more powerful than either alone. And maybe that's the benchmark, when you combine these elements together and compare them to how either a human or a computer acts on its own. So
it really depends on what you're using the AI for. So for example, with, reading pathologies on slides, there's no question that AI outperforms humans every time. But where it gets kind of fuzzy is like with employment decisions. So I would, the premise of my paper is AI is superior to humans because humans cannot recognize their own biases. But when you're looking at different outcomes, like with the criminal justice system, I think you have to go with David's argument that you really can't or shouldn't tolerate mistakes by AI. They kind of have to be held to a higher standard, or else why are you using it if people could lose their liberty for a wrong decision by a machine? But yeah, I think there has to be some kind of cooperation between the machine and AI, understanding the limitations of the machine, but not permitting humans to overrule an algorithmic result, which they could be doing using their own biases.
I also want to also add is that we have to it's important, I think, at this time, sort of the where we're at, the inflection point, so to speak, that we don't fall into the trap of making our decisions about whether AI is good or good for a particular task with reference to, is it going to be better than humans? Because if you're asking in the sense of it's going to be more accurate, it's going to be more efficient, that's one dimension to look at it. But I'll go to Robert's sort of case study with emotional AI as an example. Just because there's a problem and just because AI could solve it should not be a reason why we do it. I mean, there's so many more philosophical, ethical, and human values and principles that go into just getting it to be more accurate. If, for example, if we got AI systems to be able to read your mind better than a human could read your mind, right? That's really what these emotional AI systems are trying to achieve, the gold standard. Do we want to have systems that can read our minds? And if the answer is yes, there's still the second question of how do we want to be using them? If we're using them to treat people with mental health issues, maybe that would be acceptable. But if we're using them to surveil people's thoughts, which is how the same technology can be used in a totalitarian regime, and how I think that they're probably going to be using it in China based on how they're using these technologies today, then just because the technology can accurately know your emotions better than, let's say, a clinician is not a reason why we should want this technology. We have to think about the societal effects.
On this somber note, I see that we're about out of time. So please join me in thanking the panelists for a truly inspiring and thought-provoking panel. And let me turn it back over to Sean to MC us through the next steps.
The next steps, I believe, rather than letting artificial intelligence tell your computer what to do now, you should probably make your choice. Let me again really thank all of our participants today and the students, other folks, alumni, elected officials that have been on the program today. We very much appreciate everyone's participation and the thoughts and ideas that you brought to the program today.